thank you. It's great to be back again. I mean, you get me twice, which I don't know who set that in the program, but thank you. So as was mentioned before, I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is an organization which works in situations of conflict and violence to bring protection and assistance to victims, and also to ensure the implementation, or endeavor to ensure the implementation of the rules of international humanitarian law, which many of you may know as the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, and trying to get parties to conflict to agree on implementation of those rules, and that humanity and the principle of humanity should be respected in situations of conflict. Highly complex environments, and many ask the question, why is the ICSC looking at digital transformation? Interestingly, when you look at many of the contexts where conflict is happening today, they're happening in urban areas increasingly, and they're happening in middle-income countries, countries that were highly connected and where people were very used to using technology. And people's behaviors are changing, and they're used to using the means that we all use in their daily lives. And so with that, what we have seen is things like technology, Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is, in many contexts, perceived as a need by persons that are affected. And I remember the ICSC president coming out, having visited besieged areas in Syria, and coming out from that and saying one of the questions that was asked of him was, well, what about Wi-Fi? Can you bring Wi-Fi? Bringing that to persons that have been under siege, where normally we receive questions about security or access to medical supplies, access to hospitals, access to water, food, shelter. Now, on that list is also Wi-Fi, because it has become critical as people need to remain connected, and it's become critical for people also to receive information about the security situation, information about their relatives, and also increasingly to receive assistance and advice about how they should behave, or how they should read the environment that they're living in. So the ICSC had to start looking at this a few years ago and try to understand what might this mean for the future of humanitarian action. And we're living in a period of history where the notion of protracted armed conflicts is the norm. So everybody thinks of the ICSC as being an emergency organization. You think we go in, the situation of conflict, and then we leave. In actual fact, the average time that we're in the top conflicts, that we are the biggest conflicts where the ICSC is present, is 36 years. It means we are on the spot for at least 36 years in many of those contexts, and in some it is more than 50 years. So in those situations, you cannot wait for the conflict to be over in order to respond to some of the pressing humanitarian challenges that people have. So we had to start looking at, well, how could technology respond to some of the changing behaviors that people have, but also looking at the opportunities that we might have as an organization in order to be able to bring better responses to the needs of people, but also try to understand how could we mitigate risk. What are the risks? Do we understand the risks behind the use of certain technologies, not only by us, but more widely in the sector? And what I would like to focus on now is just a couple of those examples. So I mentioned before the break the notion of families going missing. At the moment, there are more than 70 million people who are displaced because of conflict, violence, migration, climate. 70 million people on the move. The ICSC is currently seeing a peak in people who are approaching the ICSC because of information about missing people. And we will all sit here and think, well, in today's environment, with so many means to connect via smartphone or computer, how can you go missing? Well, everybody thinks that. And I'm sure you all did. When you left home this morning, you didn't give it another thought about whether you would be able to get back to your home, and whether, if your family was no longer there, where they might be. And that is the reality for many people in situations of conflict. And when I started my career in the ICSC, I started in the former Yugoslavia, and what I was doing was trying to find news about families that were separated. 25 years later, we're still dealing with the aftermath of that conflict in terms of trying to find out the fate of missing relatives through exhumations, forensic analysis, and trying to piece together the events that led to people's disappearance to try to find out where they may be. So with that environment, what we looked at there in the ICSC was to say, knowing that 25 years on, we will still be looking at crises to try to find out the fate of missing people, what has changed in the digital environment? And there, what we recognize is that people are connecting digitally, they're uploading information about their fate, their journey, where they're going. Could we aggregate that in a way that could help us find out what has happened? But also, could we use facial recognition technology, algorithmic reading, to try to determine the fate of missing people? And this is highly complex, and it links to the health dynamic, because we had to start looking at what are the implications of that. If you find information through facial recognition, are those systems able to actually respond to the different types of people that we work with? And most training sets are not trained on the populations where we are searching. So we've had to look at how do we train data sets, how do we work on algorithmic reading with a view to trying to resolve some of those issues. We also looked at the very real humanitarian challenge of if you do find a match, but you actually don't have a body, you don't know where that person is, but you have information, is it the right thing to do to inform the family? How do you handle breaking news when you actually don't know maybe the fate or the last resting place of somebody? So that type of concern is a very real concern where we think technology can respond, but we also have to look at the dilemmas and the challenges in responding to that. And trust is absolutely critical for the ICSC, both for its acceptance on the ground with parties to conflict, but also with the beneficiaries that we aim to assist and protect. If we are not a trusted organization, then who would be? So we have to look at the due diligence behind that technology and those systems to look and see and make sure it doesn't do any harm, and not doing any harm to people in the virtual environment, but also in the physical environment. And so we have to look behind systems, and we have to try to understand them. So what we launched a few years ago was a data protection office in the ICSC to look at the notions of privacy, to look at the notions of how do we protect our data, and how do we also evaluate emerging technologies to assess whether it actually could be used in humanitarian action and could be used responsibly, keeping in mind this do no harm principle. And so in that journey over the last few years, we've had to actually develop new policies in the organization, not only on data protection itself, but on things like biometrics. So last month, the governing board of the ICSC adopted a biometrics policy. And we had to ask ourselves some very critical questions around biometrics. Obviously, in the search for family and missing relatives, we are asked to hold DNA, we're asked to take facial recognition. Increasingly, there is the need to hold on to a lot of personal information about individuals. And biometric, so that is clearly important in the delivery of our humanitarian programming. But then there are biometrics which are increasingly being collected with the view of having efficiency or more effective programs. For example, duplication of aid. What happens if you bring assistance to individuals in situations of conflict and then they come back and try to get more aid? And so normally, we used to do fingerprinting. So we would take the fingerprint of individuals on a list who were entitled to receive that aid. But it actually wasn't the fingerprint we measured. It was the indelible ink on the finger of the person who came to collect the aid. And it was that fingerprint that we put down, and we knew, because of the indelible ink during the 2 or 3 day aid distribution, that they shouldn't receive aid again. They'd already received it. But what if you're keeping that digitally? So when you do it digitally, you can start to collect and hold a lot more information on a person and use it beyond the purpose for which it was collected. And that's where we had to start looking in the ICSC and say, should we do that? Should we collect biometric data on individuals, even though it is not the purpose for which it was being collected, i.e. the distribution of aid or forensics? It was actually about efficiency or effectiveness of our action. And we came to the conclusion, no, we shouldn't. And that was for very specific reasons, because of the risks of holding too much data on individuals and the obligation to ensure that you hold that in the most secure ways because of the risks to individuals. So we obviously have strong data security, data protection rules in place, but we want to ensure that we're putting that all those efforts and investments in areas where it's critical for our programming and not where it's critical for effectiveness. And so we had to come up with a token system whereby the individual holds their data, their biometric data, and the token is what the ICSC checks to assess whether they are due to receive aid. And that might seem an anodyne example, but I will give you a reason why that's so critical. There are challenges that we are faced with. For example, who should receive aid? And there are, increasingly because of the desperation in situations of conflict, families that suddenly become larger. Children are moved into another family to make the family size larger so that people can receive aid. And this happens in many contexts. And so there's been a very real debate about people saying, well, okay, we should take the DNA of children with a view to assessing whether they are part of that family. Take a situation of armed conflict. You may have a child that's actually born of rape, of sexual violence, but the family, the community, other than the mother, may not know. Is it right? So would you then go back and tell the family, this child isn't yours? With all the ethical dilemmas behind that. So in a situation of conflict and violence, what we have to identify is the opportunities, but also the vulnerabilities and the risks, and make sure that when we are leveraging technology, we're leveraging technology in a way that is the most optimum, that we have done the due diligence, because the people who we are there to assist and protect are not able to do that. We have to do that on our behalf. And if we all think about the ways that we behave on a daily basis, we all check the box of have you read the terms and conditions? Do you agree to the terms and conditions? And we assume that somebody else that is much smarter than us or more time has done that due diligence. So we happily click and tick the box and say we have. Well, studies have shown that people will click the box even when it says, I will give away my firstborn child. So that is because people don't have the time to do it, and they assume it's been crowdsourced. We cannot do those assumptions in situations of conflict, and we cannot assume that those affected by conflict are able to do that. And choices that we make for convenience are not choices that people would make when they're sitting in situations of conflict and violence, where actually this is a matter of lives and dignity, and this can have serious impact on people's security. So I would just conclude by saying we see massive opportunities in terms of digitalization. We are engaging in that. I'm the director of that for the ICSC. We see many opportunities. We're working in many different fields to improve our accessibility, our proximity to people, including through digital means. But what is absolutely critical is that when we do that in a responsible way, and we do that having tested and analyzed the different ways that technology can create harm, that we look at the legal, the technical, the organizational challenges of using emerging technologies like blockchain, like big data analytics, algorithmic reading, AI, and that we also identify some of the very critical issues that have to be kept in that. Trust. People have to be able to trust the ICSC. We also look at human-centeredness. Humans have to be involved in decision-making that affects lives and livelihoods. And so that we have to make sure that human is still clearly in the center of that, and that we have to make sure that this is fundamentally about people. It's not about technology. Thank you.